Okay, everybody see that screen okay? Yes, because you've turned off your volumes. Right. Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you. I'm not sure what you think when you hear the word Greenock nowadays, but perhaps I won't ask for replies. Some Glaswegians have been heard to say, the satellite port of Glasgow, a dormitory town, or dare I say it, Electric Soup Valley, El Dorado Valley. Bit cruel, but never mind. Anyway, I am here tonight to declare independence from the grand Ouija metropolis. If you'd been asked the question in the 18th and 19th century, I believe you might have replied somewhere along the lines of upstarts, competitors, rivals, or somewhere to invest our money. I could, of course, be accused of being totally parochial, but that is my position. As I have been working in the Maclean Museum for about 30 years, and I've fortunately had access to the archives and the collections there. And this is a certificate of the Greenock Hammermen Society dating from 1794. It was made out to a Hugh Crawford Jr. And as you can see, I'll give you some close-up details of the certificate. I haven't been able to find out who Hugh Crawford is. It's quite a common name locally, but Crawfords were merchants, or the ones that I've seen have been local merchants. But so close-ups of the certificate. I presume this is the ideals of society, of the Hammermen Society, to promote the work, promote those working in it, and to give alms and respite to those who need it, which I think is happening in this scene. It looks like the deathbed of a hammerman and somebody coming along to help. This scene shows what I believe is the potteries in Greenock, which is just at Cartstike, or was at Cartstike. And of course, ships and shipping. Here's a wonderful photograph from 1889 of the United Coppersmiths Trade Protection Association. As you can see, it's still raining in Greenock, as it was raining in there. But this is a close-up of a larger photo, and I think it's wonderful. You know, you just look at you see some Highland shawls in the foreground, you know, and of course the coppersmith. These look like sugar refining equipment. So, who is possibly the most famous engineer in the world? Yes, Mr. Watt. Now, despite claims by various people and organisations over the years, James Watt is in fact from Greenock. I did see at Kilburn Grove once the claim that he was Glaswegian. And reading the history of the Glasgow Hammermen by Harry Lumsden, I see there's been quite a heated debate as to whether Watt was welcomed with open arms by the trade, being neither the son of a burgess or born in the borough. He was an intruder. However, the summing up, Mr. Lumsden's summing up is quite apt. It is sincerely to be hoped that no more charges in relation to James Watt will be made against the incorporation of Hammermen, the Corporation of Glasgow, or the Trades House, and that those already made will now be discountenanced. The story that they persecuted and prohibited or prevented James Watt from starting business in Glasgow is nothing more than a baseless myth. It is perhaps too much to hope that future historians and biographers will pay more attention to modern historical methods and recognise the great need in such work for personal investigation and research. So it's all about your sources. Don't believe everything you read, is I think what the Hammermen were saying. Now, I don't think I need to add much more about the man and his impact on engineering and society in general. However, in recent times, his life has been re-examined in some regards as to his source of wealth. Either how his father made his money and how James Watt got on in the business. He was, of course, part of the merchant class of Greenock, who were intrinsically linked with the trade to North America and the West Indies and its reliance on the slave economy. But that is a whole other topic, and one which I will return to briefly. Right, the image on the right is the earliest mention of Hammermen in the Greenock archives. And of great interest is that it is the accounts of John Scott, founder of the Scots of Greenock shipbuilders. And it's his, on his death, it's the will, or what was left, or what was to be divided on his death. And one of the witnesses is the father of James Watt. So it's a nice link there between James Watt and the Scots of Greenock, one of the oldest firms in the world, or was, and more successful. As I say, this is a picture of the Westburn Yard, which is where the West Coast Cinema is in Greenock. Not the traditional yard that you think of for Scots, but down at the Westburn. And it shows the launch of a West Indiaman, the Christian, at their Westburn Yard for the Glasgow merchants, Stirling and Gordon. I showed this to Stephen Mullen, who's been doing a lot of research on the slave trade and the slave connections with Glasgow. And he said it's the only image he's ever seen of a sugar merchant and the ships that they used. So it was a West Indiaman. The Scots family, and this is how we get the links. The links are through family history or genealogy. So you think the Scots, they built ships, yes, but when you look through their collections and their marriages, you find that they were married quite often to sugar merchants, the daughters of sugar merchants, and the daughters of slave owners, basically. And this is continued throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. So currently the argument is, would the Industrial Revolution have taken place if it wasn't for the money made in the West Indies? Again, a whole wide topic, but one that can't really be denied, I don't think. Scots were partnered with a company called the Sinclairs, and the Sinclairs were involved in the engineering side. They had their yard at Cartsburn, or their engine works at Cartsburn, and it was previously owned by Brownlee in 1796, in turn sold it to Scott Sinclair and Company in 1825. As you can read, the firm was said to have made the largest engines that had then been turned out, and their employees were given as about 200. The engineering works of Caird and Company further east were started as a foundry in 1809, and the making of engines in 1826. And these engines weren't necessarily for ships. They were one of the first railway engine manufacturers. That tends to get lost in the shipbuilding story. These are the maps of the works from 1825, 1859, up to 1960s. So you can see the east end of town, Crawfordsdyke, Cartsdyke, and the expansion. This is a drawing of the improved screws for marine propulsion by Scott Sinclair and Company of Greenock. The Sinclair connection is an interesting one, again, because if you look into the genealogy, you'll find that the Sinclairs were merchants in Greenock and London. And I needn't tell you where they made most of their money. Working with the Hamiltons of Greenock, they would indeed go on to run an armoury in London. This is the Hamiltons. And they sold rifles to the South in the American Civil War. And they also, through Laird at Birkenhead, built the blockade runners. So the Greenock connections are everywhere. And if you know me at all, I'll get a Greenock connection to absolutely anything and everywhere. Just a couple of images of staff at the Scots Engine Works. This is this is Cunningham Scott and his family, who was probably the biggest, the most influential of the Scots, who did the most to expand the business. And you can see that there was a connection in that they built the dockyard and refinery in Hong Kong. And this was due to their connections with the Swires and the Holts. And of course, if you know your business and if you know your billionaires, you will realise that the Holts and the Swires are intimately connected with the HSBC. So again, connections everywhere. Now, this is an image from the beginning of the railways in Greenock, coming to Greenock in 1841. And it shows you just what Greenock was like. Harbours and manufactories. And this was, as I said, Robert Sinclair. I didn't say Robert Sinclair. Robert Sinclair was a nephew of one of the Sinclairs who had his apprenticeship at Scots of Greenock. And he went on to become the superintendent of the Greenock Paisley Glasgow Railway, and then the Caledonian, the Great Eastern. He married the daughter of John Campbell, a controller of customs in Greenock. And this was one of his engines that he built. In this painting, you can also see that the point, the whole purpose of the painting is to show the coming of the railway. The coming of the railway, as I said, was in 1841, and it's a major event in the history of Greenock. It soaked up investment from all the leading merchants, and it was seen as a great opportunity for the local area. And this is where I start my beef with Glasgow, because poor old Greenock thought, well, you know, now that we've got a train service to Glasgow, the Glasgow merchants will start investing in Greenock more and will just transport by train all the goods and all the material that is needed. But of course, those pesky Glaswegians had another idea and continued with the deepening of the river and the expansion of the harbours and quays at Glasgow. So the idea, and let's say it's a genuine idea of competition that Greenock had, was a battle with Glasgow. Now, the first mention in the newspapers of Hammermen of Greenock was a George Allen of the Clyde Forge, who lived at Rose Hill in Greenock. And you can see this on the map. Hamilton Street, which is, if you know Greenock at all, is where Kincaid's was eventually. This is the Clyde Forge. And in the newspapers, he was known as the father of the craft. So this is in 1835, I think he's mentioned. He lived just on the hill. In fact, if I look out my window, he lived about 50 yards away from where I'm staying now. So he lived above where the forge was. The other mentions are quite interesting. In that 1854, the Clyde Forge is mentioned for the ability to forge iron plates for batteries in the Baltic. You know, so it's what we call the monitor ships, which were basically floating gun platforms. So they were mentioned as being suppliers of iron plate, and were also suppliers of axles for the railways. And this piece talks about how they tested it beyond beyond breaking to such an extent that the railways couldn't, the actual engines couldn't be seen to be failing as a result of anything made by the forge. But in fact, at that time, there had been a lot of accidents down to the weakness of the axles, but not in the case of Allen's Clyde forge. So we talked about Watt and Scott's and the first mention of Hammermen, but we're going to talk now about a project that was possibly one of the greatest ideas for engineering, I think not of all time, but it shows you that we've come around to thinking the same way. And this was the Shaw's Waterworks. The idea, of course, was to build a system for powering engines by water power in order to create industry. And it's interesting, like, because I think if you grow up in Greenock, you sometimes feel that the Shaw's Water was made to supply water, drinking water for Greenock. But no, it certainly wasn't. It was a business opportunity. And the shareholders, if we come back to our original point, the vast majority of the shareholders had earned their money in the West Indian and North American trade. So my argument backs up the argument that the money from that trade created something to establish the industrialisation of the west of Scotland. The other interesting thing was Robert Thom wrote, the effects which anything even approaching to this would produce upon the town of Greenock would be immense. Property would instantly rise in value. The increased demand would not only raise the rents of the present buildings, but new ones would be erected in every quarter. Nor would the effects be confined to the town of Greenock only. All the country round would assume a life and vigour unknown before. The increased demand for produce would enable farmers to improve their lands. Cottages and villages and villas would be seen rising in every direction, and in the end, the proprietors of the lands would share largely in the general prosperity. I have already remarked that perhaps no place in the kingdom is better situated for applying water power to public works on a large scale than Greenock. Where, for instance, would such a view present itself as 30 or 40 elegant and extensive public works rising like a crescent above Greenock, all in full activity and all impelled by water? Here you would have no steam engines vomiting forth smoke and polluting earth and air for miles around, but on the contrary, the pure stream of the mountain, flowing past in ceaseless profusion, carrying along with it freshness, health and vigour, whilst on its progress throughout the town, everything having a different tendency would be swept before it into that great reservoir of health and purifier of the elements, the ocean. In a word, were these works judiciously placed and tastefully constructed, they would present by far the grandest object of art to be seen on the banks of the Clyde. Now that's quite a mission statement. That's like a prospectus for utopia in some respects, or industrial utopia. But of course, none of this worked out because of the railway turned up 14 years later, and the Clyde was deepened, all so that Glasgow could have a better or closer access to the raw materials that were coming from Lanarkshire, etc. So the iron, the steel later, the coal, that was the push which sort of put this out of business. I realise we're getting on, so again, just a general view of the Shaw's Water, the list of subscribers. And I'm just going to go through quickly some of the other famous companies in Greenock. Caird and Company. The Caird family has been connected with shipbuilding from early in the 19th century, the firm of Caird and Company having been established as an engineering concern in Carstike. The Cairds were the first builders of locomotives on the Greenock, Paisley and Glasgow line. The main impetus behind the Cairds was James Tennant Caird. It's quoted, the history of shipbuilding on the Clyde is but a reflex of the history of the life of the late Mr. James Tennant Caird. As far back as 1841, in association with John Scott Russell, who subsequently built the Great Eastern, now lying off Greenock, Mr. Caird constructed and designed the first steamships of the Royal Mail Company. His yards were at the Westburn, and again later became Harland and Wolff during after the First World War, and possibly the less said about post 1900 shipbuilding, the better in some respects, in that it was all about amalgamations, and as a result, mostly of Lithgow, that the Caird yard failed within about 3 or 4 years because Lithgow shut it down. So again, a view from the water of Cairds, and a view over the town, which was on the left, the old West Kirk, or the glebe. So this was right in the centre of town. The old saying was that you could walk from Langbank, or just outside Port Glasgow, to Greenock without seeing the water once. This is Arthur Caird, and again, they made rather a large amount of money, the Cairds, and most of their collections are, their collection of paintings are in the Watt Institute now. This is a lovely drawing of an engine. You can tell I'm an engineer at heart because I called it an engine. I'm not sure quite what it is, but I'm sure you guys will know more. Something like a side steeple or something. Anyway, lovely. From the social history point of view, this is a lovely photograph of the foreman, and these were the days. If you look at the length of service, 51, 44, 43, 41, 41, all the years that these men gave in the service. The next important man would be Thomas Kincaid, one of the leading men in his obituary. One of the leading men of the past generation, Greenock, died at his residence in Greenock at the patriarchal age of 88. To the older men of the town, his name will call up many associations which have for years been almost lost sight of. But although his calling was of the sea, the prominent qualities of his mind were of a strongly inventive mechanical turn, which showed themselves in every relation to his life. He was an attractive man with whom to talk with regard to machinery, and in respect to any novelty or invention, his originality of mind was always sure to lead him to the solution of the problem. One of these, he is noted as being an inventor of the screw propeller, and he brought the idea before the British Association. And one of these propellers that was fitted to a ship launch, worked by hand, and submitted the model to the association. In 1851, he had to do with the equipment of the first steamer called the Duncan Hoyle, which was sent to Australia. His son, John G, became the more famous right up until the 1980s. They did provide most of the engines for the Lithgow conglomeration. Lovely letterhead, I think, of the Clyde Foundry and Engine Works, John G. Kincaid. They did a bit of everything. And this is a photograph from the 1880s of the Clyde Foundry. So this is before and after. So again, Kincaid's, I hope I'm right in saying that you will all recognise that name as one of the biggest providers of engines. The famous K of Kincaid's, and lovely images of engines made by that company. And to get a bit political, or to get a bit nearer what's going on today, here is Kincaid's engineering the model of Wood's Comet, the replica which sailed from Port Glasgow, the Scott Lithgow Basin in 1965, I think it was, for the centenary, bicentenary. No, it would have been 150 years. So the importance of Kincaids, and still the importance and the slight political note of what's happening with the Comet replica today. Next up is Hastie's, again a name in which, if you look through the internet, you will see this name coming up constantly in sales of steering gear and steering wheels. So the fame of Greenock goes about the world from John Hastie. The works were off Nicholson Street in Greenock, and we have a lovely collection in the archives of internal shots of the works. They were in glass slides and they come up absolutely beautifully. Anyway, enough photography porn, but they really are beautiful industrial images. Again, the 3D element of this photograph from a glass slide shows the steering gear in great form, and again here. Right, I think we've got another 5 minutes. So Edward Blackmore, Rankin and Blackmore. This is when I mentioned Mick and our grandfather, or my grandfather, your great grandfather, worked in Rankin and Blackmore's, and this is Edward Blackmore. This is Daniel Rankin, and these are the engines of the paddle steamer Waverley, being made in 1941, I think. And yes, that's my grandpa. So in the middle with the bonnet and holding the spade, that's Dennis Gillen, who worked in the Rankin and Blackmore. I mentioned the Woods, but I won't say much more about them, in that you don't come more famous than the Woods and the building of the first steam, or the first ocean-going or sea-going steamboat, and the effect it's had on the history of engineering on the Clyde. This is a picture of Sam Bowes. It's not a very good picture, but it's a painting of Woods Yard in Port Glasgow. And this is where it was situated. And general arrangement of the Comet. Another famous family firm were the Steeles. Originally Steele and Carswell, the two fell out. Famous for building quality ships, they'd built the largest paddle steamer at the time, and they had Ayrshire connections, such as relatives, as they were relatives of the Allens, of the Allen line, and also with McIver and Burns of Cunard. This is always helps when a shipbuilder, when you're either married into, as they say in Greenock and Port Glasgow, married onto relatives of shipping companies. They went on and built some of the most famous tea clippers that have ever sailed the world. Unfortunately, the company was liquidated in 1883, having built over 300 ships, and the Steele's Yard became what we knew or know as Scots of Cartspan. This is the Britannia, which is built by Caird and was of the Cunard line. These are the Steeles. And this is the Ariel, one of the famous tea clippers. Another famous, I could go on, give me 2 more minutes. This is Walter Kinnipple, who was responsible for building the James Watt Dock, the biggest civil engineering project in Scotland and Greenock's last bid to compete with Glasgow. This was a complete failure and the financial ruin of many investors. It was equivalent of Northern Rock. A rumour started that the dividends couldn't be paid, and by the end of the week, the James Watt Dock and the Greenock Harbour Trust had gone bust. The harbours were basically built too small and became obsolete very quickly. And of course, Glasgow decided that we'll carry on. It was, as I say, it was brave in some respects in that they put their money where their mouth was, but it failed drastically. But the interesting thing was the engineering, and that Mr. Kinnipple was an expert in the use of concrete in underwater. And also getting the fact that we call the sugar sheds today, but they were never intended as such. And by they didn't start holding sugar until the 1950s. This is a lovely image of how it was planned. This is an image of it currently. And these are some views of it in construction and on its opening. In recent years, it has been a store for cars, and the ironwork, which was unique in some respect in that it was hollow pillars which were used to transport the grain about. And I'll quickly shift through Blake and Barclay, who were responsible for sugar. They built the refinery in Hong Kong. This is their symbols that were used in their marches. And I have one little note, a fact I like to say. This is Cromer Pier, and it was built by Alfred Thorne of Greenock. He also built the Newport Transporter Bridge. And almost finally, here is Agnes Borthwick. Agnes Borthwick was the first and only female leader or in charge of the munitions work at Georgetown, which is at Bishopton. In this next slide, it shows you the letter that she received saying exactly what she did and how she was the first woman to do it and the role she played in being in charge of such a huge works for providing ammunition. So I'll finish there. And these are most of the material that I've just gone through is available in these books that I've just published. And it tells the story of famous Greenockians, their families, and the industry. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vince. Clearly, there's about 20 separate talks in there, each of half an hour. And I was interested that you finished up with Miss Borthwick, who I know well. I would add that it was a wee gift to me. She was a Greenock girl. She was the daughter of people in the sugar industry, and as Vince said, she was the only woman to be not just in charge of women in munition works, but in charge of running a whole factory with all the technical stuff. Right, so friends and colleagues, if you have questions or comments, would you like to turn your